Thanks for being with us today. And Mark, thanks for inviting me to do this. And I think this week especially, we've all been traumatized. We need to escape into some literature and think about a different world. Not an altogether better world, but at least a different world with different problems than we all have at the moment. So that's why I'm going to read from Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. And it's a book that I thoroughly enjoyed reading with a book group a couple of years ago. And I thought there were messages for our time in it. It talks about class, it talks about race, it talks about family relationships, the meaning of motherhood to various different people. And it has a couple of intersecting plots. And I'm going to focus on two extracts which bring up two parts of the plots. First, I'm going to start at the beginning, and in a way, after you have read the first paragraph or two, you think, why do I need to read this novel? They've told me the whole story here. But what they haven't told you is all the nuances, and they haven't told you about all the people that are involved in those little fires everywhere. So let's start at the beginning. Everyone in Shaker Heights was talking about it that summer, how Isabel, the last of the Richardson children, had finally gone around the bend and burned the house down. All spring, the gossip had been about the little Mirabelle McCullough, or depending which side you were on, Mei Ling Chow. And now at last, there was something new and sensational to discuss. A little afternoon on that Saturday in May, the shoppers pushing their grocery carts in Hynem's heard the fire engines wail to life and careen away toward the duck pond. But at 12:15, there was 4 of them parked in a haphazard red line along Parkland Drive, where all 6 bedrooms of the Richardson house were ablaze, and everyone within a half a mile could see the smoke rising over the trees like a dense black thundercloud. Later, people would say that the signs had been there all along, that Izzy was a little lunatic, that there had always been something off about the Richardson family, that as soon as they heard the sirens that morning, they knew something terrible had happened. By then, of course, Izzy would be long gone, leaving no one to defend her, and people could and did say whatever they liked. At the moment the fire trucks arrived, though, and for quite a while afterward, no one knew what was happening. Neighbors clustered as close to the makeshift barrier, a police cruiser parked crosswise a few hundred yards away, as they could, and watched the firefighters unreel their hoses with the grim faces of men who recognized a hopeless cause. Across the street, the geese at the pond ducked their heads underwater for weeds, wholly unruffled by the commotion. Mrs. Richardson stood on the tree lawn, clutching the neck of her pale blue robe closed. Although it was already afternoon, she had still been asleep when the smoke detectors had sounded. She had gone to bed late and had slept in on purpose, telling herself she deserved it after a rather difficult day. The night before, she had watched from an upstairs window as a car had finally pulled up in front of the house. The driveway was long and circular, a deep horseshoe arc, bending from the curb to the front door and back. So the street was a good 100 feet away, too far for her to see clearly, and even in May at 8 o'clock, it was almost dark out besides. But she had recognized the small tan Volkswagen of her tenant Maya and its headlights shining. The passenger door opened and a slender figure emerged, leaving the door ajar, Maya's teenage daughter, Pearl. The dome light inside the car, the dome light lit the inside of the car like a shadow box, but the car was packed with bags nearly to the ceiling, and Mrs. Richardson could only just make out the faint silhouette of Maya's head, the messy top knot perched at the crown of her head. Pearl bent over the mailbox, and Mrs. Richardson imagined the faint squeak as the mailbox door opened, then shut. Then Pearl hopped back into the car and closed the door. The brake lights flared red, then winked out, and the car puttered off into the growing night. With a sense of relief, Mrs. Richardson had gone down to the mailbox and found a set of keys on a plain ring, with no note. She had planned to go over in the morning and check the rental house on Winslow Road, even though she already knew that they would be gone. It was because of this that she had allowed herself to sleep in, and now it was 12:30 and she was standing on the tree lawn in her robe and a pair of her son Tripp's tennis shoes, watching their house burn to the ground. When she had awoken to the shrill scream of the smoke detector, she ran from room to room looking for him, looking for Lexi, for Moody. It struck her that she had not looked for Izzy, as if she had known already that Izzy was to blame. Every bedroom was empty except for the smell of gasoline and a small, crackling fire set directly in the middle of each bed, as if a demented Girl Scout had been camping there. By the time she checked the living room, the family room, the rec room, and the kitchen, the smoke had begun to spread, and she ran outside at last to hear the sirens, alerted by their home security system, already approaching. Out in the driveway, she saw that Tripp's Jeep was gone, as was Lexi's Explorer and Moody's bike, and of course her husband's sedan. He usually went into the office to play catch-up on Saturday mornings. Someone would have to call him at work. She remembered then that Lexi, thank God, had stayed over at Serena Wong's house last night. She wondered where Izzy had gotten to. She wondered where her sons were and how she would find them to tell them what had happened. By the time the fire was put out, the house had not, despite Mrs. Richardson's fears, quite burned to the ground. The windows were all gone, but the brick shell of the house remained, damp and blackened and steaming, and most of the roof, the dark slate shingles gleaming like fish scales from their recent soaking. The Richardsons would not be allowed inside for another few days until the fire department's engineers had tested each of the beams still standing, but even from the tree lawn, the closest the yellow caution tape would allow them to come. They could see there was little inside to be saved. Jesus Christ, Lexi said. She was perched on the roof of her car, which was now parked across the street, on the grass bordering the duck pond. She and Serena had still been asleep, curled up back to back in Serena's queen size, when Dr. Wong shook her shoulder just after 1, whispering, Lexi, honey, wake up, your mom just called. They had stayed up past 2 a.m. talking as they had been all spring about little Mirabelle McCullough, arguing about whether the judge had decided right or wrong, about whether her new parents should have gotten custody or if she should have been given back to her own mother. Her name isn't really Mirabelle McCullough, for God's sake, Serena had said at last, and they'd lapsed into sullen, troubled silence until they both fell asleep. Now Lexi watched the smoke billow from her bedroom window, the front one that looked over the lawn, and thought of everything inside that was gone, every t-shirt in her dresser, every pair of jeans in her closet, all those notes Serena had written her since 6th grade, still folded in paper footballs, which she'd kept in a shoebox under the bed. The bed itself, the very sheets and comforter charred to a crisp. The rose corsage her boyfriend Brian had given her at homecoming hung to dry on her vanity, the petals darkened from ruby to dried blood red. Now it was nothing but ashes. In the change of clothes she had brought to Serena's, Lexi realized suddenly she was better off than the rest of her family. In the back seat, she had a duffel bag, a pair of jeans, a toothbrush, pajamas. She glanced at her brothers, at her mother still in her bathrobe on their tree lawn, and thought, they have literally nothing but the clothes on their backs. Literally was one of Lexi's favorite words, which she deployed even when the situation was anything but literal. In this case, for once, it was more or less true. Tripp, from his spot beside her, absent-mindedly ran one hand through his hair. The sun was high overhead now, and the sweat made his curls stand up rather rakishly. He had been playing basketball at the community center when he heard fire trucks wailing, but had thought nothing of it. This morning he'd been particularly preoccupied, but in truth he would likely not have noticed them anyway. Then at 1, when everyone was hungry and decided to call it a game, he'd driven home. True to form, even with the windows down, he had not noticed the huge cloud of smoke wafting towards him, and he only began to realize something was wrong when he found his street blocked off by a police car. After 10 minutes of explaining, he had finally been allowed to park his Jeep across from the house, where Lexi and Moody were already waiting. The three of them sat on the car's roof in order, as they had in all the family portraits that had once hung in the stairwell and were now reduced to ashes. Lexi, Tripp, Moody, senior, junior, sophomore. Beside them they felt the hole that Izzy, the freshman, the black sheep, the wild card, had left behind, though they were still certain, all of them, that this hole would be temporary. "What was she thinking?" Moody muttered, and Lexi said, "Even she knows she's gone too far this time. That's why she ran off. When she comes back, Mom is going to murder her." "Where are we going to stay?" Tripp asked. A moment of silence unreeled as they contemplated their situation. "We'll get a hotel room or something," Lexi said finally. "I think that's what Josh Trammell's family did." Everyone knew this story, how a few years ago Josh Trammell, a sophomore, had fallen asleep with a candle lit and burned his parents' house down. The long-standing rumor at the high school was that it wasn't a candle, but it was a joint. But the house had been so thoroughly gutted that there was no real way to tell, and Josh had stuck to his candle story. Everyone still thought of him and as that dude, Jack, who burned his house down, even though that had been ages ago and Josh had recently graduated from Ohio State with honors. Now, of course, Josh Trammell's fire would no longer be the most famous fire in Shaker Heights. "One hotel room for all of us? Whatever, 2 rooms, or we'll stay at the Embassy Suites. I don't know." Lexi tapped her fingers against her knee. She wanted a cigarette, but after what had just happened, and in full view of her mother and 10 firemen, she didn't dare light one. "Mom and Dad will figure it out, and the insurance will pay for it." Although she had only a vague sense of how insurance worked, this seemed plausible. And in any case, this was a problem for adults, not for them. The last of the firemen were emerging from the house, pulling the masks from their faces. Most of the smoke had gone, but a mugginess still hung everywhere, like the air in the bathroom after a long, hot shower. The roof of the car was getting hot, and Tripp stretched his legs down the windshield, poking the wipers with the toe of his flip-flop. Then he started to laugh. "What's so funny?" Lexi said. "Just picture Izzy running around striking matches everywhere," he snorted. The nutcase. Moody drummed a finger on the roof rack. "Why is everybody so sure it is she?" "Come on," Tripp jumped down off the car. "It's Izzy, and we're all here. Mom's here. Dad's on his way. Who's missing?" "So Izzy's not here. She's the only one who could have been responsible." "Responsible?" put in Lexi. "Izzy?" "Dad was at work," Tripp said. "Lexi was at Serena's. I was over at Sussex playing ball. You?" Moody hesitated. "I biked over to the library." "There, you see." To Tripp, the answer was obvious. The only one here was Izzy and Mom was asleep. Maybe the wiring in the house shorted, or maybe somebody left the stove on. "The firemen said there were little fires everywhere," Lexi said. "Multiple points of origin, possible use of accelerator, not an accident." We all know because she's mental, Tripp leaned back against the car door. You're always picking on her, Moody said. Maybe that's why she acts mental. Across the street, the fire trucks began to reel their hoses. The 3 remaining Richardson children watched the firemen set down their axes and peel away their smoky yellow coats. Someone should go over and stay with Mom, Lexi said, but no one moved. After a minute, Tripp said, when Mom and Dad find Iz, they're going to lock her up in a psych ward for the rest of her life. No one thought about the recent departure of Maya and Pearl from the house on Winslow Road. Mrs. Richardson, watching the fire chief meticulously taking notes on his clipboard, had completely forgotten about her former tenants. She had not yet mentioned it to her husband or her children. Moody had discovered their absence only earlier that morning and was still unsure what to make of it. Far down Parkland Drive, the small blue dot of their father's BMW began to approach. What makes you so sure they'll find her? Moody said. Now we'll go to another segment about another thing that is a potential little fire. By this time, Maya, who is an artist and very short of money, is working for the Richardsons, making their dinner each night and doing some cleaning. The weekend after Thanksgiving, while Mrs. Richardson was still irked at Izzy, the Richardsons were due to attend a birthday party thrown by old family friends. Can Pearl come too? Moody asked. The McCullers won't mind. They've invited everyone they know to this thing. Plus, she'll be one more person to gush over the baby, Izzy said, which you know is what the whole party is about. Mrs. Richardson sighed. Izzy, there are times when it's appropriate to invite one of your friends and times when events are just for family, she said. This is a family event. Pearl is not part of the family, she snapped. And she snapped her purse shut and slung it over her shoulder. You need to learn the difference. Come on, we're late. So only the Richardsons went to the McCullers that weekend, arriving in 2 cars, Lexi and Tripp and Moody in one, Mr. and Mrs. Richardson in another, with a glowering Izzy in the back seat. No one could have missed the house. Vehicles filled both sides of the street. The McCullers had cleared the parking restrictions with the Shaker Heights police in advance and spilled over onto nearby South Woodland Boulevard, and an enormous bundle of pink and white balloons bobbed over the mailbox. Inside the house was already full to overflowing. There were mimosas and omelet stations. There were caterers offering bite-sized quiches and poached eggs in puddles of velvety hollandaise. There was a 3-tiered pink and white cake, draped in fondant and topped with a sugar figurine of a baby holding the number 1 in its chubby hands, and everywhere pink and white streamers unfurling their triumphant way around the kitchen table, where Mirabelle McCullough, the birthday girl, nestled in Mrs. McCullough's arms. Mrs. Richardson had met Mirabelle before, of course, months earlier, when she'd first arrived at the McCullough household. She and Linda McCullough had grown up together, Shaker class of 1971, old friends since meeting in 2nd grade, and there had been a lovely symmetry to their paths as they'd both gone away to school and come back and settled in Shaker into careers of their own. Only where the Richardsons had right away had Lexi, then Tripp and Moody and Izzy in quick succession. Mrs. McCullough had undergone over a decade of trying before she and her husband had decided on adoption. It's just providential, as my mother used to say, Mrs. Richardson had said to her husband on hearing the news. There's simply no other word for it. You know what Mark and Linda have been through, all that waiting. I mean, I bet they'd have taken a crack baby, for goodness sakes. And then out of the blue, the social worker calls them at 10:30 in the morning saying there's been a little Asian baby left at a fire station and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there she is in their house. She'd gone over the very next day to meet the baby, and in between cooing over the child, heard Linda recount the story, how she'd gotten the call and had driven directly to Babies R Us, buying everything from a complete wardrobe to a crib to 6 months' supplies of diapers. Maxed out the visa, Linda McCullough had said with a laugh. Mark was still putting the crib together when the social worker pulled up with her. But look at her, just look at her. Can you believe this? She bent over the infant, cradled against her with a look of pure astonishment. That had been 10 months earlier, and the adoption process was underway now. They hoped to have finalized it in a month or 2. Mrs. McCullough told Mrs. Richardson as she handed her a mimosa. Little Mirabelle was a darling thing, a fuzz of dark hair topped by a pink ribbon headband, a round, pert face with 2 enormous brown eyes staring out at the crowd, Mrs. McCullough's beaded necklace clenched in her fingers. "Oh, she looks like a little doll," gasped Lexi. Mirabelle turned her face away and buried it in Mrs. McCullough's sweater. "This is the first big party we've had since she came to us," Mrs. McCullough said, running a hand over the girl's dark head. "She's not used to having so many people around. Are you, Mimi?" She kissed the baby's palm, but we couldn't let her first birthday go by without a celebration. "How can you know it's her birthday?" Izzy asked, "if she's abandoned and all?" "She wasn't abandoned, Izzy," Mrs. Richardson said. "She was left at a fire station where someone would find her safely. It's a very different thing. It's brought her to a very good home." "But you don't know her real birthday then, do you?" Izzy said. "Did you just pick some random day?" Mrs. McCullough adjusted the baby in her arms. "The social workers estimated she was 2 months old when she came to us, give or take a couple of weeks. That was January 30th. So we decided we'd celebrate November 30th as a birthday." She gave Izzy a tight smile. "We think we're lucky to be able to give her a birthday. It's the same as Winston Churchill's and Mark Twain's." "Is her name really Mirabelle?" Izzy asked. Mrs. McCullough stiffened. "Her full name will be Mirabelle Rose McCullough once the paperwork goes through," she said. "But she must have had a name before," Izzy said. "Don't you know what it is?" As a matter of fact, Mrs. McCullough did know. The baby had been tucked into a cardboard box, wearing several sets of clothing and cocooned in blankets against the January cold. There had been a note in the box, too, which Mrs. McCullough had eventually convinced the social worker to let her read. "This baby name, Mei Ling. Please take this baby and give her a better life." That first night, when the baby had finally fallen asleep in their laps, Mr. and Mrs. McCullough spent 2 hours flipping through the name dictionary. It had not occurred to them then or at any point until now to regret the loss of her old name. "We felt it was more appropriate to give her a new name to celebrate the start of a new life," she said. "Mirabelle means wonderful beauty. Isn't that lovely?" Indeed, staring down that night at the baby's long lashes, the little rosebud mouth, half open in deep and contented slumber, she and her husband had felt nothing could be more appropriate. "When we got our cat from the shelter, we kept her name," said Izzy. She turned to her mother. "Remember, Miss Purry? Lexi said it was lame, but you said we couldn't change it because it would confuse her." "Izzy," Mrs. Richardson said, "behave yourself." She turned to Mrs. McCullough. "Mirabelle has grown so much over the past months. I wouldn't recognize her. So skinny before, and now look at her. She's chubby and glowing. Oh, Lexi, look at those little cheeks." "Can I hold her?" Lexi asked. With Mrs. McCullough's help, she settled the baby against her shoulder. "Oh, look at her skin, just like cafe au lait." Mirabelle reached out and laced her fingers into Lexi's long hair, and Izzy drifted sullenly away. I don't get the obsession, Moody murmured to Trip in the corner behind the kitchen island, where they had retreated with paper plates and quiche and pastries. They eat, they sleep, they poop, they cry. I'd rather have a dog. But girls love them, said Trip. I bet if Pearl were here, she'd be all over the baby. Moody could not tell whether Trip was mocking him or simply thinking about Pearl himself. He wasn't sure which possibility bothered him more. And now we move on just a few pages more. Her hair is so gorgeous, Lexi said. I've never seen such hair on a little baby, so silky. And she has the biggest eyes. They just take everything in. She's so alert. They found her at a fire station. Can you believe that? Someone literally just left her there. Across the room, Maya, who had been wiping the countertop, froze. A fire station, she said. A fire station where? Lexi waved a hand. Oh, I don't know. Somewhere in East Cleveland, I think. The details had been less important to her than the tragic romance of it all. And when did this happen? January, something like that. Mrs. McCullough said that one of the firemen came out for a smoke and found her in a cardboard box. Lexi shook her head, like she was a puppy someone didn't want. And now the McCulloughs plan to keep her? I think so. Lexi opened the cupboard and helped herself to a Nutri-Grain bar. They've wanted a baby forever, and Mirabelle appeared, like a miracle, and they've been trying to adopt for so long. They'll be such devoted parents. She peeled the wrapper from the granola bar and popped it into the garbage can and went upstairs, leaving Maya deep in thought. Maya's arrangement with Mrs. Richardson paid for their rent, but she and Pearl still needed money for groceries and the power bill and gas, so she had kept a few shifts per week at Lucky Palace, which between wages and leftover food was just enough to keep them supplied. Lucky Palace had a cook, a prep cook, a busboy, and one full-time waitress, Bibi, who had started a few months before Maya. Bibi had come from Canton 2 years earlier, and although her English was rather choppy, she liked to talk with Maya, finding her a sympathetic listener who never corrected her grammar or seemed to have trouble understanding her. While they rolled plastic silverware in napkins for the dinner takeout orders, Bibi told Maya quite a lot about her life. Maya shared very little in return, but she'd learned over the years that people seldom noticed this. If you were a good listener, which meant you kept the other person talking about herself. Over the course of the past 6 months, she'd learned nearly all of Bibi's life story, and it was because of this that Lexi's account of the party had caught her attention. For Bibi a year earlier had had a baby. I so scared then, she told Maya, fingers working the soft paper of the napkin. I have nobody to help me. I cannot go to work. I cannot sleep. All day long, I just hold the baby and cry. Where was the baby's father? Maya had asked, and Bibi had said, gone. I tell him I having baby, 2 weeks later he disappear. Somebody told me he moved back to Guangdong. I moved here for him, you know. Before that, we live in San Francisco. I'm working in dentist office as a receptionist. I get good money, really nice boss. He get a job here in the car plant, he say. Cleveland is nice. Cleveland is cheap. San Francisco so expensive. We moved to Cleveland. We can buy a house, have a yard. So I follow him here, and then. She was silent for a moment, then dropped a neat rolled up napkin onto the pile, chopsticks, fork, and knife all swaddled together inside. Here nobody speak Chinese. I interview for receptionist. They tell me my English not good enough. Nowhere I can find work. Nobody to watch the baby. She had probably had postpartum depression, at the very least, Maya realized, perhaps even a postpartum psychotic break. The baby wouldn't nurse and her milk had dried up. She had lost her job, a minimum wage job packing styrofoam cups and cartons. When she'd gone into the hospital to have the baby and had had no money for formula. At last, and this was the part Maya felt could not be a coincidence, she had in desperation gone to a fire station and left her baby on the doorstep. 2 policemen had found Bibi several days later, lying under a park bench, unconscious from dehydration and hunger. They'd brought her to a shelter where she'd been showered, fed, prescribed antidepressants, and released 2 weeks later. But by then, no one could tell her what had happened to the baby. A fire station, she'd insisted. She'd left the baby at a fire station. No, she couldn't remember which. She'd walked with the baby in her arms round and round the city, trying to figure out what to do. And at last she'd passed a station, the windows glowing warm against the night sky. And she'd made up her mind. How many fire stations could there be? But no one could help her. When you left, you terminated your rights, the police said. Sorry, we can't give you any more information. Bibi, Maya knew, was desperate to find the daughter again and had been searching for her for many months now, ever since she'd gotten herself back together. She had a job now, a steady, if low-paying one. She'd found a new apartment. Her mood had stabilized, but she hadn't been able to find out where her baby had gone. It was as if the child had simply disappeared. Sometimes, she told Maya, I wonder if I'm dreaming, but which one is the dream? She dabbed her eyes with the back of her cuff. I can't find my baby, or that I've had the baby at all. In all her years of itinerant living, Maya had developed one rule: don't get attached to any place, to any apartment, to anything, to anyone. Since Pearl had been born, they'd lived, by Maya's count, in 46 different towns, keeping their possessions to what would fit in the Volkswagen. In other words, to a bare minimum. They seldom stayed long enough to make friends anywhere, and in the few cases where they had moved on with no forwarding address and lost contact. At each move, they discarded everything they could leave behind and sent off Maya's art to be sold, which meant they'd never see it again. So Maya had always avoided getting involved in the affairs of others. It made everything simpler. It made it easier when their lease was up, or she'd grown tired of a town, or she'd felt uneasy that she would have to be somewhere else. But this with Bibi, this was different. The idea that someone might take a mother's child away, it horrified her. It was as if someone had slid a blade into her and with one quick twist hollowed her out, leaving nothing inside but a cold rush of air. At that moment, Pearl came into the kitchen in search of a drink, and Maya wrapped her arms around her daughter quickly, as if she were on the edge of a precipice, and held her for so long and so tightly that Pearl finally said, Mom, are you okay? These McCullers, Maya was sure, were good people, but that wasn't the point. She thought suddenly of those moments at the restaurant after the dinner rush had ended and things were quiet, when Bibi sometimes rested her elbows on the counter and drifted away. I'm fine, she said to Pearl, and with a wrenching effort, she let her daughter go. All finished here, let's go home, okay? Even then, Maya had a sense of what she was starting. A hot smell pricked her nostrils, like the first wisp of smoke from a far-off blaze. She did not know if Bibi could get her baby back. All she knew was that she thought of someone else claiming her child. All she knew that the thought of someone else claiming her child was unbearable. How could these people, she thought, How could these people take a child from its mother? She told herself this all night and into the next morning. As she dialed and she waited for the phone to ring, it wasn't right. A mother should never have to give up her child. Bibi, she said, when a voice picked up on the other end. It's Maya from work. There's something I think you should know. So there we have the story of two fires and some intersecting families. And it's also a story of a lot of teenage sentiment and the relationships between Pearl and all of the four Richardson children, the relationship between Maya and Mrs. Richardson. Mrs. Richardson, by the way, has a first name, Alana, but it's, I think, only given once or twice in the book. She's always Mrs. Richardson. And then there's the relationship between Maya and Bibi, and then the intersection of the McCormicks and Bibi and the baby. And then it ends with several fires, but I found it really intriguing all along the way. Has anybody else read the book?
Greta and I have been watching the Reese Witherspoon has produced a TV version of it on Hulu.
Oh yeah, yeah.
We were halfway through, and it is just, we think it's real. I think it's terrific. Very, very, very true to the book, apparently.
Yes. Oh, that's great. I saw that it got good reviews, but I haven't watched it. I'm always a little reluctant to watch a favorite book on the screen because you develop your own ideas of the personalities, and you're not quite certain that Reese Witherspoon or anybody else is your image of Mrs. Richardson.
Well, she's very good at playing entitled, clueless women. I don't think you'll be disappointed.
So Dan, does it keep the name of the book, the series?
Yes.
Okay. And how many have you read the book? I'm sorry, I didn't remember, but have you read the book first?
No.
Okay.
I just read good things about it, and I liked Reese Witherspoon's.
She's fantastic.
What was that series she did? Something.
Little something.
Yeah, Little Lies.
Yeah.
Yeah, something about lies.
Yeah. Big Little Lies.
Yeah.
Little Lies.
Yeah, which was that's why I watched. That's why we watched it.
And so Kerry Washington was Maya in the book, I gather. So
Yeah.
they introduced another element of race into the TV series. Because I know
That's not in the book.
you don't know anything. You don't know whether.
Oh, because that's a major theme.
Maya and Pearl.
That's a major theme in the TV show.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because there's the sort of Asian entitled white issue, and there's the poverty of Maya and Pearl against the entitled family with all their cars, the Richardsons, and Maya and Pearl just have their beat up Volkswagen. And there are some race issues that come up in the book among the friendships of the Richardson children, but Maya and Pearl are sort of unidentified by race.
Huh.
So I don't know whether the author intends you to draw your own conclusions or what.
That's a major change then.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you, Kristin. I think there's going to be some conflict about whether the McCullough should adopt the baby or not, or who should do that.
Yes.
Am I clairvoyant on that one? Because
Clairvoyant is always Mark. Yes. Yeah. Yes, there is, and there is a court case about it, and people in the community take up side. Serena Wong, who's Lexi's friend, is on one side, and Lexi is on another, and we got a little inference of that in the section I read about, because Lexi was staying over at the Wong's house. And Maya's on one side, and of course Mrs. Richardson is very much on the side of her friends, and Mr. Richardson, who is a lawyer, takes the case for the McCullough family. So there's a huge rift in the relationships that have been established. Pearl has become very much part of the Richardson family. But again, there are little nuances that, Lexi, who goes out and buys clothes all the time, as this teenager who's sort of following in her mother's footsteps. And then Pearl takes her to a thrift shop and, explains to Lexi that these are all really interesting vintage clothes. So vintage clothes will appeal to Lexi, whereas, Pearl needs to shop at a secondhand clothes store. So there are some really great nuances all the way through. And she's a wonderful observer of teenage behavior. I didn't, in the snippets, you just, at the beginning, just got the three of them sitting on the car, you got a sense of those teens. And in a sense, Moody is the one really sympathetic member of the Richardson family. Moody, who's the third kid in order, and he's the first one to befriend Pearl, and he's not sort of wrapped up in the sort of stereotypes of affluent suburban kids.
Anybody have any questions that they'd like to discuss about with Kristin about the book? Anybody have any comments they'd like to make? You can just unmute yourself and see what discussion occurs.
Kristin, what happened with Izzy? Did she start the fire, or is that an unknown?
It's a known. Yes, she did start the fire. Yes. So that's an intriguing, the first two paragraphs spell out the entire plot, and but you still get wrapped up in how it unwinds, and Izzy, there are all those comments about Mrs. Richardson putting down Izzy. Well, Mrs. Richardson's put down Izzy all her entire life, and Moody is the one who realizes that. He's the sort of sensitive kid, and as he says to his siblings in the early part, well, is there any reason that she acts mental the way she's treated, And then there are very complicated reasons for why Izzy did it, and she expects to go off and find Maya and Pearl and set up her own life with Maya and Pearl. And then there are some nuances towards the end that Mrs. Richardson isn't quite as much of a demon about her youngest daughter as she had appeared to be. But that's not really fully explored.
Any other comments people would like to make, or if anybody has any experience with interracial adoptions that they'd like to share?
Yeah, that whole thing is, I think, is beautifully handled, and there is the surprising twist to the book is around that situation of the adoption and so on. So if anybody's going to read the book, and perhaps for Greta and Martin, who haven't yet, seen the last of the series, I won't give that away. But that's a very interesting twist.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I do have a very short story that relates to this. And this is years ago, but a friend of mine adopted a little boy from Korea, and he was maybe 3 or 4 when he came, and it was difficult. He was crying, he was upset. So she got someone who speaks Korean to talk to him, and it turns out when they went to the market together, he thought she was stealing, because in Korea when he came, they would go to the meat vendor, they would go to the vegetable vendor, so when she went to the different sections and just picked up and left and walked around with a cart, she thought she was stealing everything. And once we got that settled, then everything was okay. And he's quite a prominent artist now, so you know how old that story is.
There was also a television program, I'm not sure which program it was on, but it had a similar theme where a couple adopted a baby, and then the birth parents came forward and they had to go to court. And in the end, as I recall, there was an agreement as to the role the potential adoptive parents would play, even though the natural parents got the custody. They didn't want to be out of his life, but they were no longer the parents, the legal parents. So it does get complicated.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for the kid too.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I mean, and you get these nuances. I'm not sure if the TV version will be able to get into the nuances, but everybody's different opinions on it and the reasons they form their opinions is really fascinating.
Well, Kristin?
What? And just one more point, and of course, Maya, in that last section I read, refers to fire in terms of that she's going to pick up the phone and call Bibi and tell her that she thinks she knows where her daughter is.
Mm-hmm.
What were you going to say, Mark?
I was going to say that whenever a book club recommends a book to me and I don't choose it, I go, that one. And they all turn out to be really wonderful books. How did you feel when your book club suggested this book?
I felt excited about it because I happened to have snuck a look at those first couple of paragraphs, and I thought, oh, this is intriguing, because there are not all that many novels that just pull you right in from the onset like that. But I have the same feeling as you about book clubs that you think, oh, do I really want to read that? But then you find that you've expanded your horizon, and so that's the whole point of a book club, I think. Really.
Yes, trust the people that recommend them is hard in the beginning, but as you go on, you get a much better feeling that people who recommend books are recommending really good books to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for doing this.
Sure.
Thursday's going to take a different tact. We're going to do P.G. Wodehouse, The Clicking of Cuthbert, which is he's a famous guy, as you know, on short stories, and it's about golf. So we went from putting out fires to golf. We hope to see everybody on Thursday.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you all so much.
All right.
Bye. Thank you.